Hi class and welcome back to Social Psych. Today we're going to cover Chapter 7, Persuasions. And to do so, it's important to note that we need to go back a chapter and kind of review what we discussed in attitudes, recognizing that attitudes are our evaluations of people, places, things, whatever it is, on terms of a kind of a positive to negative dimension. So how we like or dislike something. When we break attitudes down, we can break them into three components. The affective or emotional component, how we emotionally feel about this thing. Behaviorally, we can discuss what we do regarding this thing. And cognitive components, that is our knowledge, our beliefs, all of that kind of information regarding this specific object, whatever it is. We know that attitudes can change. We know that people can go from disliking something to liking or reverse, but how? And well, one question to kind of look at that is a bit interesting. If you look at this painting, you might feel a certain way about this. Do you strongly dislike it or do you strongly like it? Somewhere in the middle. What if I told you this was a painting by Adolf Hitler? Does that change how much you like it? Similarly, how about this quote? I hold that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing and is as necessary in the political world as storms are in the physical. And Thomas Jefferson is quoted as basically saying, it's okay to be a little violent and rebellious. It's just like how storms come about. Do you agree with that? Disagree with that? What if I told you that quote wasn't by Thomas Jefferson, was by Osama bin Laden? Does that change how much you agree with this? Probably. So one way we could change attitudes theoretically is cognitive dissonance. We could realize that, oh, I don't like that. But this doesn't work for large-scale attitude change. Right? We can't get people to cognitively have this cognitive dissonance. Otherwise, nobody would be smoking, right? Because they would realize it's bad for them. How we actually get people to change their attitudes is persuasive communications. So communications that are advocating for this side, that side, whatever it is. That leads to the question, what are persuasive communications? Like, what makes a communication persuasive? And so we are going to talk about two different things here, the elaboration likelihood model and these different specific elements of persuasion. So let's discuss this ELM or elaboration likelihood model. And so this is the idea of who I should, right, like how should I persuade you about something? And so the elaboration likelihood model is going to argue that there are two different routes to persuade people. The first is the central route. So this is going to be an effortful and controlled processing route versus our peripheral route, which is going to be effortless and happen automatically. And these are known as these peripheral or kind of side cues that aren't exactly relevant. So a central route argument would be asking you to pay attention to the quality of an argument. Is this a good argument? Where a peripheral route is just something else that gives you some info. For instance, right, these two pictures, well, they're going to get us maybe some different info, but these are both pictures that you're going to be used, are going to try to be used to persuade you to buy a car. So which car do you want? Well, you'd argue that this Volvo ad is going to be using more of the peripheral route, right? These cues aren't directly relevant. This woman seems happy with this car, right? It's pretty. On the other hand, right, you can talk about this central route processing where you've got a lot of different information about here. However, some of this information might actually just be trying to get you to think, oh, these are all good. Does it really matter what kind of tires you get on this? We'll get to that later. So the elaboration likelihood model is going to argue that when we have a persuasive message, there's going to be two routes to attitude change. The first and more common route is our peripheral route that typically happens when we're not paying attention. The less common route is going to be our central route, one we're going to really be thinking about here. So the central route, again, is going to be more effortful, more controlled. And so if you are sitting here trying to figure out which college you want to go to, you're going to use a central route, right? When you are looking at all of the persuasive messaging you're getting from all of the colleges, you're going to say, what matters to me? And so your attitude is going to change when you're really thinking carefully, focusing on this central processing message. Compare that to your peripheral route, the one that's going to happen more often than not, unless you're really trying to do this. Your attitude change is going to happen without much thought. As you're scrolling through, TikTok, Twitter, whatever it might be, you are going to be seeing ads, and those might be trying to change your opinions about things. Are you really paying attention to what's going on? No. So, what is it that affects whether or not you will take the central or peripheral route? 3 factors: your motivation, your ability to actually take the central route, and your opportunity to take the central route. So keep those in mind. But another kind of way to look at this is that if you want your attitude to be changed, give good arguments. If you want people to think deeply, use the central route to change their attitude. If maybe, you don't have a good, persuasive message as to why people should do the things they do, focus on the peripheral cues. Use somebody famous to just say, buy our product, yay, right? Because that's going to better this. Now, the book has this undercurrent, and as I'm talking to you via YouTube through this box, I feel this is a bit weird, but what's the internet doing to us? Think about this. Think about this kind of broadly. You are being bombarded with all types of messages all days that are giving you peripheral cues to try to make you feel a certain way. Having people you like, famous people, giving you just a list of arguments as to why this is the best product over everything else, or saying things like, oh, everybody else is buying this or agrees, right? The idea that we're being distracted and constantly overrun in our minds. And, it makes me wonder what is happening to us. But I'm going to jump off my soapbox there and ask a question here. If you see an ad like this, there's a lot of arguments in favor of the Samsung phone in this ad. You'd argue that the number of arguments in this is going to be a peripheral cue. Not only that, some other peripheral cues you'll note are the bright screen here, the dark screen here. Which one looks more enjoyable here? Also, if you read some of these, they're not really good things to put on here. That's why it's in very small font. Right? The fact that it has a standby mode, not something too great. So one factor that I would like to bring up, though, is the idea of quality and expertise of an argument. So imagine, right, you are getting this argument here that there should be mandatory comprehensive exams at the end of your senior year of college. And so college students are given this task, right? They are asked to read arguments in favor of comprehensive exams. Now, I don't know if you know this, but people don't like comprehensive exams. So when we had them looked at these arguments, we differed the type of arguments. We looked at relevance, so whether or not this would go into effect before you graduated. So high relevance would be like, this is going to go into effect at the end of this year, theoretically. So, you would have to do it. Low relevance, this won't be going into effect for 5 years, so you should be out of here. Argument quality, so giving good arguments, like it makes you, imagine that an argument says something like, colleges that have mandatory comprehensive exams tend to produce graduates that make more money. Well, that's a good argument for a comprehensive exam. However, you could get bad arguments like, it makes our school look better. That's not a good argument. And then source expertise. Who was telling us this information? An expert or just some bum off the street? And so let's look at these. We can look at strong arguments and weak arguments, expert versus non-expert, and the colors are personally relevant versus not personally relevant. So when things are personally relevant, you'll notice people feel a lot more strongly about this. If you knew that these exams were going to affect you, when you read strong arguments, you were persuaded to actually agree. When you read weak arguments, arguments that were like, this will make our school look better, this made you a lot less likely to agree. So when this matters to you, when it is relevant, you pay attention and you focus on strong arguments. You are using the central route. Look at the other side. When you are listening to an expert, it only matters when you don't care, right? When this isn't relevant to you. If you found out that 5 years there's going to be comprehensive exams down the line, but the expert says they're really, really good, you're going to go, yeah, sure, whatever. I agree with you, dude. It doesn't affect me. I don't care. On the other hand, if you are if you are just listening to some student say this and it's not relevant to you, you're going to say, why do you have anything to say about this over me? So recognizing that if it's relevant to you, the argument quality matters. You better give people good arguments. If it's not relevant to you, throw some expert in front of them to tell them that it is good, and people will believe it. Yikes, a little bit. All right, so let's move on to the next section here where we're going to talk about different elements of persuasion. So this is the kind of the combination of the elaboration likelihood model and what used to be called the Yale attitude change, or these elements of persuasion. In reality, they've all kind of been grouped into one big model, but I still teach it as two separate ones to not confuse us. So if you want to think about this, you would argue that the elements of persuasion are going to be the specifics of the ELM, the elaboration likelihood model. And the elements of persuasion are going to argue that there's three major areas that we can focus on with persuasion. And it's best thought of as the saying, who says what to whom? So who is giving the message? What are they saying? Who is hearing the message? And that if you focus on these three factors, you can really work on giving a good attitudinal message here. So let's talk about the communicator. Who is giving the message? Well, you want somebody who looks expert, right? Looks like an expert, who is perceived to be trustworthy, who looks credible. One way to look extra credible is if you are arguing against your self-interest. So if I tell you, if I am the head of a company and I say, well, I don't want everybody to buy our product. I only want people to buy it who will use it. You're going to say, most people want you to just buy it no matter what. So you might argue that I sound like a more credible person here. Speaking quickly and without hesitation. People who talk a little faster instead of talking kind of like this, because these people probably don't sound like they know what's going on. Speaking quickly and without hesitation gives people an indication you understand what you are talking about. There you go. Attractiveness. Unfortunately, physical attractiveness does help out. There is a reason that in the past we have used pretty girls and pretty boys to just stand around handing out free samples. It makes people like them more, right? So not only that, but we also like things that are similar to us. So we can talk about similarity. So we like people who look like us. We like people who act like us. This halo effect as well, that it turns out that physically attractive people, we tend to argue that they're probably smarter, funnier, and more likable. This is called the halo effect, that beautiful people seem to have this halo around their head that they can do no wrong. Is that the truth? Not necessarily, but it is something that does happen. Let's talk about message effects. So one thing that is important is how frequently you are repeating your message. This can be both above liminal, so like supraliminal, so like, just repeating things like wash your hands for 20 seconds, wash your hands for 20 seconds. The more you do that, the more likely it's going to stick. This can also be subliminal. If this is not something that's necessarily being paid attention to, it still can affect you. Repeating this message out loud, hearing it a lot is going to increase agreement and increases what we recall. Simpler messages. You want a simple message that is easy to understand if you want to get people to agree with you. And not only that, the more arguments you have for your side, the more you are going to look like somebody who is effective here. However, this is mostly for the peripheral route, given that we would only want strong arguments for the central route. One thing to ask about the message effects is this idea called the sleeper effect. But we know that the message quality and speaker credibility matter, so we only want credible speakers. Why do tabloids work then? Well, they have these sleeper effects. The idea that you remember the message, but you forget who told it to you. So this is kind of the idea that, you hear somebody tell you that the lizard people control the governments on Earth, and you're like, okay, crazy. And normally what happens is, you just forget this over time. However, what ends up happening in the sleeper effect is you remember the thing. right? You remember the fact that somebody told you that the government is being controlled by lizard people. However, you forgot that it was a crazy person that told you. You forgot where it came from. So the idea is that you hear this message and you entertain it. You realize that that source is untrustworthy, so you say, oh, I shouldn't listen to that. But over time, you've forgotten that that source was there. And so you think, well, I heard this from somewhere. Maybe it was Wikipedia. Maybe it wasn't the National Enquirer. And so then you are going to remember the message because of that because of that mere exposure. Additionally, with the message, we can talk about vivid information. The more vivid this message is, the more persuasive it is. If there is an identifiable victim, right? So the idea of these kind of advertisements you see online, having a sad person or a sad puppy, that's a lot more powerful than if you just read something that said, people are starving, can you help? Right? So like having this person on the screen is going to make this more identifiable for us. Finally, this idea of fear appeals, a message warning about others of danger. So, right, we hear that don't smoke, smoking causes cancer. Well, it depends on how you kind of frame these questions, right? So if you tell people like, don't smoke or you will die, that's too extreme, right? That's too fearful, and it's probably not actually going to help. So what is going to help is if you say something like, smoking can cause cancer in you. Talk to your doctor about ways to reduce, the amount you smoke, coupled with behavioral recommendations, how to change your attitudes or change your behaviors. In the slides is an ad for, death bowling for HIV victims. This is a very, very old ad from Australia. It's one of the worst ads I've ever seen. It's a very, very like gruesome, not gruesome, but kind of like dark ad. And it's just not a very good one. So if you're interested in looking at that, I highly suggest it. But moving on to the audience effects, the whom. So who are we talking to and how are we going to understand them? So one of the most important factors here is personal relevance. So of course, do you care about this topic or not? So if you are involved, if you have ego involvement, issue involvement, personal involvement, you're going to care about this more. On the other hand, another factor that we probably all would recognize is mood. So having a good mood makes us more likely to be persuaded. And this is the Janus mood study where we actually just asked people to come in and read an article and tell us how you felt about this. Half the people were told to eat lunch beforehand, half the people were told not to eat lunch beforehand. And you see that having food typically makes people a lot more likely to be persuaded. So something you can think about. Another thing we can talk about more specific to audience members, like we mentioned in the last chapter, is embodied cognition by asking people to nod their heads yes or no, or nod their heads yes or shake their heads no. We can make people like these more. So this study asking people to test headphones by making movements left or right or up and down, and then asking how much they agreed with what they listened to, found that people who nod their heads agree more with what they're hearing. Some other individual differences that affect people: intelligence. Being low intelligence is you're more likely to be persuaded. Need for cognition, something kind of related to intelligence, but are you a kind of person who desires thinking a lot? Are you a kind of person who will sit there and do crossword puzzles? Or are you just going to sit there and watch paint dry? And finally, we know that being a younger individual, right, being somebody who is very much involved in peer pressure, this is going to be related to making people more likely to be persuaded. And the final one we talk about is the fact that distraction is going to make an important point here. That if the message is delivered by a credible person, and if there's a lot of arguments, but they're not really strong, if you're distracted, you're likely to be persuaded by something like this. So that's kind of our overview of these elements of persuasion. And you might be wondering, okay, well, what can I do with that? Well, I always like to do this fun one in class, is this idea of how does persuasion relate to things like cults, which do exist. We can talk about Marilyn Manson, Jim Jones, David Koresh of Waco, Marshall Applewhite, Heaven's Gate. All of these people were cult leaders. And when we talk about a cult, at least how I'm going to talk about it, this is going to be specific rituals that or beliefs that people do. It's devotion to something. Could be a god, could be a person, could be an idea. The important note that makes cults different is that cults tend to isolate you. They tend to take you away from your friends, your family, your community, because those people are evil, quote unquote. And almost always, cults have charismatic leaders, people who are persuading. So if you were to think about what you need to build a cult here, you need a charismatic and trustworthy leader, somebody who is going to get up there, make people feel comfortable, and sound like they are trustworthy, that they tell these things that are important. You want to have your crowd be afraid of something. The world is scary, but I have the answers. What you do is once they're in there, you continuously give them these easy to follow messages. Stick with the plan, so that they see these recency of these messages, this mere exposure of these messages. And you start to give these one-sided appeals. You only give one side of the argument. You don't argue against your best interest. Who do you get to take these cults? People who don't know what to do next, people who are at a crossroads, who are looking for direction, people who are often under 25, who are somewhat educated and middle class. And so, if you are all interested in joining a cult, we can go ahead and build one. Please contact me. I'd love to have a second in command. Anyways, in reality, let's also kind of put on our tinfoil hats for a minute and talk about the media and how it persuades us. So to do so, let's start off with this terrifying statistic. The average adult spends over 12 hours a day consuming media. 12 hours a day, half of our day. If you sleep for 7 hours, you're consuming media for the majority of your waking hours. A lot of those. What's interesting for people is that we appreciate stimuli more when we are watching this with others. For instance, people will enjoy watching the Super Bowl more at their own home, alone, when they know that other people are watching it. This is why things like Twitch or YouTube Live or things like that are going to be interesting, because people enjoy watching these together with other people. However, it's important to recognize that the media can't talk about everything. We don't have enough bandwidth. So the media theoretically is able to control what we are focusing on, change the agenda, what is important. And that can actually shift what we call our Overton window. And so your Overton window is, and this is not something that's really exam worthy, but is very important to me, is the idea of what is seen as okay and what is seen as not okay in terms of our culture. For instance, if you look at the Overton window towards bicycles, in most cities in America, our Overton window tends to be more on the side of pro-car and anti-bike. But what if all of our media for the next 10 years were just talking about how terrible cars were and focusing on how great biking is? Eventually, over time, this window might shift upwards to say, wow, maybe we shouldn't just have maybe we shouldn't just have cars on the streets. Maybe we should only have bikes on the streets. And so recognizing how this can shift what we feel from one way to another. Do you think this can happen on social media? I'm here to tell you it literally has, and it did it for an experiment. This is actually a study I got to see Adam Kramer, the lead psychologist, come give a talk at when I was in undergrad. The short of the long here is they manipulated whether or not they showed your friends happy messages or sad messages you posted. And those emotional feelings actually spread throughout that. So if people are spreading positive messages, those positive messages propagate to others. If people spread negative messages on the internet, those negative messages make other people feel negative. So yes, social media can control how we feel a little bit, right? Don't totally put on the tinfoil hat, but recognizing that effect. Because on the other hand, right, we got to recognize that many of us have beliefs about perceptions of bias in the media. You might believe that X news network is completely biased and Y news network isn't. And we all think that we're the right ones. We all have this naive realism that I see the world in the right way, you're the wrong one. And one thing that we all agree on, no matter what side of the aisle you are on, if we're thinking politics here, is that everybody thinks that the media is biased against them, that we're all out to be gotten. So looking at this, right, 3 days before the 1980 election, a bunch of people were called up and they asked them, hey, who are you going to vote for? Right? Who do you think the media is in favor of? And look at these statistics. 83% of Carter reporters, so I'm going to vote for Jimmy Carter, while the media favors Reagan. 96% of Reagan supporters said, I'm going to vote for Reagan, and the media is favoring Carter. Interesting. So I like to think about this because, right, why do we have campaign elections? Or, right, why do we do months and months of campaigning? Well, it's important to note that campaigns aren't going to change people's specific behaviors. You're not going to go from a Democrat to a Republican or a Republican to a Democrat. However, they reinforce a specific behavior, going to vote. And that's the important one here. So to wrap up, let's talk about how it's not just what we think, it's about what we think about thinking. Metacognition, cognition about cognition, thinking about thinking. So secondary thoughts that are reflections of our primary thoughts. So, the things that we think about our thoughts. I like to think about these are the why does this make me feel this way question. Right? Oh, I felt this. Why did I feel that? One thing we can talk about, as we've mentioned before, is this self-validation hypothesis. The idea that when we are confident in our thoughts, nodding up and yes, we're more likely to be persuaded, right, through embodied cognition. Additionally, as we've mentioned in a past chapter, this idea of selective perception, different types of selective perception, but more importantly, perceptive evaluation. So what happens when we are seeing a new source of information, right? So if I were to, read a news article that says drinking coffee is bad for you, and I'm a coffee drinker, what's going to happen? I'm going to evaluate that source. I'm going to say, well, who wrote this? How did they test this? But what if I am a non-smoker and I read an article that says smoking causes cancer? Am I going to evaluate the article with that critical of an eye? No, I'm not going to care as much. I'm going to go, oh, cool. That fits my bias. That's my belief. And so this relates to the thought polarization hypothesis, the idea that as we begin to think about any given thing, we begin to stew on that thought and it begins to kind of, as I put a picture here, snowball. So if you walk out of a movie theater and you think, that movie was kind of good, and you think about it a lot, and you go online and you read about it and what everybody thinks, you're going to start to grow that opinion. That opinion is going to build and build. It's not just, oh, I like it. It's, oh, I loved it. Oh, it was my favorite movie ever. So it's the idea that our thoughts can become polarized. It can go from, I prefer cats to dogs, to at the most extreme, I hate dogs, I love cats type thinking. And then the final thing we can talk about is called attitude inoculation. And really, the best way to think about this is just like if you were getting a shot, to like a flu shot, for instance. The idea with a flu shot is that you are going to give your body a dead, weakened version of this virus in order for you to fight it off. In attitude inoculation, we're going to give you a bad argument against your belief, and that's going to charge you up and get you ready. Right? So in this study, so I should kind of describe this. So the way you want to think about this is that if you have two different people who like Stetson University's sports teams a lot, you can tell the first one, hey, I don't think Stetson's sports team is going to be very good next year. That's a tiny little attack. There's no real reason to that. That person's going to get angry and they're going to go, oh yeah, let me think about all the ways in which I'm right. On the other hand, what if I hit you with the actual flu, right? Instead of you having this inoculation? What if I hit you with, well, here's all the stats and info for why Stetson's going to be terrible next year? That's going to be a lot harder for you to counteract. So in this study, what they did was they had participants first evaluate these cultural truisms. So just these statements that we all kind of generally believe in. It's a good idea to brush your teeth after every meal if possible. Most people agree with that, right? And so what we did was we came up with attacks for each one of those truisms. So, right, it's also possibly true that if you brush too frequently, you might damage your gums. So now you've got two competing pieces of information. So what we did was we separated these into three different groups. First group of people just read the truisms. The second group of people read the attack, right, read this truism, read the attack on the truism, and then were told to argue against the attack. So this is going to be our inoculation condition. And then the third condition was going to be read the attack on the truism. So read that, brushing your teeth too frequently might hurt your gums, and then argue with that brushing your teeth might hurt your gums. A couple days later, we then asked participants to come in and give an argument, right, for or against this truism and evaluate them. And what you see here is that people, before they're given this attitude inoculation shot, right, they all agree with this. They all say, yes, it's important to brush your teeth. When we have participants read these truisms, right, or this counterattack on this truism, right, we can see that they don't support this as much. Condition 2, when we read this attack on the truism and then argue against the attack, when we give ourselves the shot, notice that we still feel the same way. We still feel a lot more strongly. On the other hand, if we are asked to read our attack and then attack it again, your defense isn't much different than if you didn't have the initial attack here. So what is this arguing? This is arguing that if you're hearing small attacks about your beliefs, you are less likely to be persuaded in the future. It's not always a good thing. But that is the end of everything we have covered for chapter 7. If you have any questions, please don't feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help you guys. I hope you all have a great day Let me know if there's anything I can do to help. Bye-bye.